All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Sure to thank our annual TALMUD Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pei 5785, the Tilson Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Sherman's Roshos this year in the zechus, besuros, tovos for all of Am Yisroel. Our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Adar, Habal Tova, Teri and Steve Czinn, loving memory of Teri's father, Dr. Harry Kahn, Tzvi Hersch, Ben Yosef HaKohen, the Ziv, Lavine and Behrman families in memory of Willian Ziv, Zev Shmuel, Ben Yisroel, and our week of learning sponsor, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in memory of Paul's grandfather, Zechariah ben Zechariah, Zichron Livracha. First, we hope to end the merit of our TALMUD Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah, should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should in Meretz Hashem bring home all of our hostages, and in Meretz Hashem our holy soldiers should be successful b'chol ma'aseh yedehem. First, with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, and a little bit less time than usual to do it in. So today's daf is Pei Vav 86. We are picking up at the Mishnah on Pei Hey with Beis 85b, and the Mishnah says as follows: Hagonev nefesh mi Yisrael. So now we're talking about the interesting sugya, fascinating sugya of kidnapping. So literally again, Hagonev nefesh mi Yisrael. A person goes ahead and kidnaps a Jew. I just want to point out how incredible it is to learn this Mishnah on Tainis Esther. Like the entire Purim story is Esther Hamalka was kidnapped. Esther Hamalka was taken forcibly from her home, taken to the palace of Achashverosh, totally against her will, against Mordechai's will. And again, the one thing we see about the Hashgachas Hashem, divine providence, is that even from the darkest and most difficult of circumstances, Geula and Yeshua comes. So how incredible it is, literally again on Tainis Esther, to begin, Hagonev nefesh mi Yisrael. Person kidnaps a Jew. What's the halacha? Now this is obviously talking about the Jew kidnapping a Jew. So what's the halacha? Inu chayiv ad sheyachnisan l'reshusah. So in general, again, the halacha for kidnapping, or the punishment for kidnapping, is misa, is punishment, is death penalty. So now the Mishnah discusses the parameters of that. Hagonev nefesh mi. So if one goes ahead and kidnaps a Jew, inu chayiv ad sheyachnisan l'reshusah. You're only chayiv if you take the victim into your reshus, into your domain. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda says, you have to, number one, take the victim into your domain, and number one, make use of them, like work them, do something to utilize them. And he quotes the pasuk, Shne'emar, this amerbo umachro. The pasuk says, the pasuk in its entirety is, Ki matzi ish gonev nefesh me'achav mibnei Yisrael. If a person will be found to have literally kidnapped a fellow Jew, v'his amerbo, he utilized him, he worked him, umachro, and he sold him, umeis haganav hahu b'yatim erekerecha. Then the kidnapper is put to death. So interestingly enough, Rabbi Yehuda says that halacha ma'aseh there's really three qualifications. Number one, kidnapping. Number two, making use of the individual. And number three, selling them. Rabbi Shmuel, what happens if someone kidnaps their son? Interesting case. A person kidnaps their son. Rabbi Shmuel ben Yochanan ben Baroka mechayiv chav the chachamim potrim. Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka says you're chayiv, and ultimately the chachamim say you're patr. Now again, we'll discuss exactly why that is. What's the machlokes over here? What happens if someone goes ahead and kidnaps a chatzi eved, chatzi ben chorin? What's the halacha? Rabbi Yehuda mechayiv v'cham potrim. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're chayiv, and the chachamim ultimately say that you are patr. Okay, so we'll say, so now a lot to unpack over here. So first things first, the Tanakama lo ba'imar. So we'll say, remember again, the first machlokes in the Mishnah was as follows. Tanakama says that if you go ahead and you kidnap someone, you're chayiv if you bring them into your reshus, to bring them into your domain. Rabbi Yehuda added on, you also have to work the individual. So I have a Gemara asks, and according to the Tanakama, you don't have to make use of the individual. And I just want to point out, the pasuk itself says, "V'his amerbo." You're kidnapping and you're making use of the individual. So how could the Tanakama disagree with that particular fact? So the Gemara says, everyone agrees that in order to be liable for biblical kidnapping, you have to go ahead and quote unquote make use of the individual. You have to work them. The shaila is what happens if you work them in a fairly insignificant way. For example, you put them to work and it only goes ahead and let's say generates less than a shava pruta's worth of work. Is that called work or not? That's the point of contention between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah asked the following question. Ganva umachro yashen mahu. So this is an interesting question. What happens imagine for a moment, Ruvain kidnaps Shimon while Shimon is asleep. So he kidnaps Shimon while Shimon is asleep and he sells Shimon. Shimon is clearly a very deep sleeper, right? So he's kidnapped and he's sold all while he's asleep. So Mahu, we'll say, what's the halacha? So ultimately, again, is there liability? Rashi said, well, again, we'll see exactly what the question is over here. So Machar Isha Ubra Mahu. Or what happens if Ruvain kidnaps Rachel? Rachel's pregnant, but Ruvain is not kidnapping Rachel for Rachel's sake. Rather, what is Ruvain doing? He wants to kidnap the fetus. He wants the baby. He wants to be able to sell the baby. What's the halacha? Yesh derech imar bekach or ein derech imar bekach? So I'll say, so is this considered to be imor? Is this considered to be, again, a form of working the individual or not? To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? There's no working of the individual in this context. Again, remember what's the case? Ruvain kidnapped Shimon while Shimon was sleeping and sold him. Ruvain kidnapped Rachel and ultimately again sold her for the Uber. So there is no imor at all. There's no working over here at all. To which the Gemara says, no, what's the case over here? No, what's the case? The case is where Ruvain kidnapped Shimon and then sold him. And after Ruvain kidnapped Shimon, what he did was he leaned on Shimon. So he utilized sleeping Shimon as a support. Or with the pregnant woman, there was a big wind, and he put the pregnant woman in front of him to shield him from the wind. So he's utilizing, he's utilizing these people in an interesting way. So is that called derech imor or not? So we'll say, so again, what you begin to see is the Gemara is accepting this approach that in order to be chayav for kidnapping, number one, you have to take kidnap a person. Number two, you have to bring them into your reshus. And number three, you have to work them. So the shaila is this called working the individual? To which the Gemara says, teku. The Gemara leaves it unresolvable. There's a tremendous Moshe Haskell on this. The Gemara's case, Reuven went ahead and kidnapped Shimon, and Shimon is asleep. He's asleep through the kidnapping, he's asleep through the sale, and so the shayla just is this called a kidnapping or not? Is that called derech imor? And I will say, you wonder to yourself, how could someone sleep through all of that? Right? How can you sleep through being kidnapped? How can you sleep through being sold? And I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that people really have a tremendous koach of shluf, that people really could sleep, and people could sleep through a lot, and people could sleep through kidnapping, and people could sleep through selling, and people could sleep through life, and you could be asleep at the wheel of life, through so many twists and turns, and you miss so much, and you don't realize so much, and how so much of our avoda in life is his orari, is to be awake. Is to be awake, is to be mindful, is to be present, is to recognize what is unfolding all around us, and specifically to take advantage of all of life's opportunities. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, Tanra Abanon, Ki matze ish gonev nefesh me'achav, Inli ela ish shaganav ish. Inli ela ish shaganav. Ishim. So we'll say, so the lashon of the pasuk is if you will find amongst you a man who has kidnapped. So I only know that there's liability for a man who is kidnapped. What about if a woman is a kidnapper? What's the liability? Talmud v'gonev ish. Pasuk says someone kidnaps. Okay, so it's not gender specific. Inli ela ish shaganav bein isha ubein ish. I know that a man is liable if he kidnaps a man or a woman. V'isha shegan v'ish. Similarly, again, if a woman kidnaps a man, isha shegan v'isha minayin. How do I know that there's liability? If a woman kidnaps a woman, Talmud lomar umeitz haganav hahu mikol makom. The pasuk says the ganav will be put to death, and again, mikol makom doesn't have anything. There's no gender specific, no person specific mentioned in the pasuk. Tanya yidach another brayso ki matze ish gonev nefesh me'achav. If a person will be found to have stolen a Jew, to have kidnapped a Jew, echad hagonev esaish ve'echad hagonev esaisha. Whether you're kidnapping a man, a woman, ve'echad ger ve'echad av meshuchrar, you're kidnapping a convert, you're kidnapping an emancipated slave. In any of these cases, you are chayiv. Okay, fine. Gunvo v'lo machro. Machro va'adat. So Gemara says, Gunvo v'lo machro. What happens if Ruvain kidnapped Shimon? And what happened? Reuven kidnapped Shimon, but he did not yet sell him. Or machro v'adayin yeshna bershuso. Or Reuven sold Shimon, but what? He has not yet delivered Shimon to the buyer. So case number one, Reuven kidnapped Shimon but didn't yet sell him. Case number two, he sold him but did not yet remove Shimon from his rishos. What's the halacha? Pater. Ultimately, if Reuven is discovered, he's pater. Now, when we say pater, he's pater from Misa. Pater from Misa. Because that's not biblical kidnapping. So this is an interesting case. What happens if Reuven goes ahead and kidnaps Shimon and then sells Shimon to Shimon's father, or Shimon's own father, or one of Shimon's own relatives? What's the halacha? Reuven is chayiv. Again, we'll discuss all of these cases. Hagonev es havadim pater. One who goes ahead and kidnaps an eved is pater. Okay, top of page vav 86a. Tani kameid Rav Sheshes. Amrlei. Anishon Rabbi Shimon holds as follows: Me'echov ad shiyotzienu mishus echav viat amrit chayiv. Shabbos says now specifically the Gemara is focusing on the case of where Reuven kidnapped Shimon and then goes ahead and sells Shimon to Shimon's father or to one of Shimon's relatives. Okay, so now, interestingly enough, so Rav Sheshes said as follows. The Tana taught before Rav Sheshes, Rabbi Shimon holds that in general, in order to be liable for selling someone, you have to sell them me'echav, from their brethren, which sounds like you're kidnapping someone from their family and selling them to someone else, which would seem to indicate to us that if Reuven kidnapped Shimon and then sold Shimon back to Shimon's own family, that Reuven would not be liable. Yet the Brisa says he is liable. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Tani Pater. No, you're right. You know what? Change it to Pater. That if Reuven were to kidnap Shimon and sell Shimon to Shimon's own family, Shimon's father, Shimon, someone else, that ultimately, again, Reuven would be Pater. So Gemara says, one second. My kusha, what's the problem over here? Dilma ha Rabbi Shimon ha Rabbanon. Perhaps it's two different opinions. Perhaps this is a machlokes, to which the Gemara said, Lo sa'adayt do Am Rabbi Yochanan, stam masnisin Rabbi Meir, stam tosef to Rabbi Nechemia, stam sifra Rabbi Huda, stam sifri Rabbi Shimon v'kulud Rabbi Akiva. No, we can't interpret it that way, because since halakha l'maisa, we have these principles about who a stam mishnah follows, a stam tosefta, a stam sifra, a stam sifri. Therefore, again, the proper way to explain this is to amend that which the Brisa said. And in fact, the halacha is that if Reuven kidnaps Shimon and sells Shimon to his own family, that Reuven is pater. When we say pater, remember again, pater means pater from death penalty. Because halacha ma'is, in order to be liable for biblical kidnapping, you have to sell the victim to someone outside of his family. Okay, fascinating. Hagonev bino. So the next thing the Mishnah said is, what happens if a person kidnaps his son? Right, kidnaps his son. What is liability for kidnapping one's own son? So remember, again, this was a machlokes. Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, said that you're chayiv, and the Chachamim said that you're pater. So let's analyze. My time in the Rabbanon. Why do the Rabbanon say that you are pater? Am Rabbi do Amar Kra, because the pasuk says ki matzei prat lematzui. Because the Rebbe said, lashon of the pasuk is ki matzei ish gonev nefesh me'echav. If it will be found that a person kidnaps someone from amongst his brethren. Now, lashon of ki matzeh indicates to us that there's a new circumstance that's here. Right? You found a new circumstance. This comes to exclude an already pre-existing circumstance. In other words, someone is found with you who would not normally be found with you. How is someone found with you if they're not normally found with you? You kidnap them. So this comes to exclude someone who normally is with you. Who's normally with you? Your child. Your child. That's the logic of the Rabbanon, who ultimately again say that you are pater. Okay. So now what you want to tell me is ki matzeh means only a new circumstance, something that was not a pre-existing circumstance. If that's the case, ki matzeh ish shochev im isha be'ulas bal. Pasuk talks about adultery. If it will be found that a man is sleeping with another woman, right, with a woman who's married to another man. So is that coming to exclude a situation where another married woman is commonly found with another married man? What's the example of that? Kigon, bayis ploni d'shchichen gabayu. So it's interesting. Rashi points out over here, Beis Ploni was this living arrangement where a number of people shared the same house. This was not like an illicit thing. Chazal weren't very happy with this because it is not a good idea for married couples to constantly be in close proximity to each other. It is a recipe. It could be a recipe for disaster. So therefore, again, but there was the situation where a number of different married couples shared the same house. So the Gemara is suggesting, you're going to tell me then that there's not liability for adultery in such a situation like this? Because why? Because since couple 1 was always around with couple 2 and couple 2 was around with couple 3, so it's not ki matzeh, it's not like a new circumstance. He wouldn't be liable for adultery. To which the Gemara says, "Hachanami diptiri." Would you say at this point, of course that would be an untenable situation? Of course not. In other words, of course there's going to be liability in that case. Hilchach, the Gemara, I'm sorry. No. I'm not learning it out ultimately again from Yimatze, rather, v'nimtsa biyado. What does the pasuk say? A man kidnapped, right? V'goniv ish umacharo, v'nimtsa biyado. Right? One person kidnaps another person, and the victim is found with the perpetrator. So v'nimtsa indicates that what? There's like something new over here, right? A circumstance that would not normally have been in effect is now in effect over here. What does that come to exclude? That comes to exclude ultimately, again, a situation of a father and a son, where the son is normally with the father. Interesting enough, therefore, again, the Gemara says, Amarav, and both say, by the way, I just want to point out, that's how he paskin. The Rambam paskin is like the Rabbanon, namely, that if a father kidnaps his son, there's not biblical liability for kidnapping. I just want to point out, when we say there's not biblical liability for kidnapping, so what does that mean? What does that mean? It means you're not put to death. You're not executed. It does not mean it's good. And of course, again, I will say, one thing to remember is, we hold also dina d'malchus dina. So remember, a lot of these, we're talking about in a vacuum where there's halacha. But if you live in a foreign country where there is its own lands, so its own laws, so we are governed by the law of the land. So it might be true that halacha says that a father kidnapping a son is not biblical kidnapping, but if dina d'malchus says it is kidnapping, then halacha l'maisa, it's kidnapping. But that's the halacha. So the Amar Rav is based on this hilchach. Hani mikri dardiki umasnu rabbanon kimitsuyin biyadan damu uptiri. So I'll say, so this is fascinating. So Rav is based on this, teachers, right? Teachers. Mikri dardiki means teachers who teach young children kriya. Umasnu rabbanon, and also teach other students skima, right? Teach rabbanon. These are people who spend a lot of time with these children, and therefore halacha l'maisa, they are not considered to be v'nimtzu. Is a technical issue over here that I guess what the Gemara seems to be indicating that if the Rebbe were to kidnap the Talmud, technically speaking, there would not be biblical liability since the Talmud spent that much time with the Rebbe, which is just an interesting window, at least from the Gemara's perspective, about how much time children spent with their Rebbeim. A fascinating idea over here. And once again, we see this motif a number of times of how the Rebbe-Talmud relationship is very much like the father-son relationship. We see that again in many different circumstances as well. Okay, in any event, takeaway from this is we paskin like the Rabbanon, and therefore halacha l'maisa, the Rambam paskins that if a father were to kidnap his son, there would not be biblical liability for kidnapping. Okay, let's go back there. Ganav misha chatziav. Shmuel says, remember again, next machlokes in the Mishnah was, if you kidnap, a chatzi eved, chatzi ben chorin, what is the halacha? So again, Rabbi Huda says you're chayiv, the chacham say that you're pater. Let's analyze. Says the Gemara, Tanan Hasam, we learn. Rabbi Huda Omer, ein la'avadim boshes. So okay, so seemingly an unrelated statement over here. Rabbi Yehuda says an Eved has no boshes. Now, what does it mean Eved has no boshes? Rashi says over here, in la avadin boshes, hamisbayesh esa Eved lo chiyafto Torah lo seis mebashto. The both say we know that there is a compensation category called boshes, called humiliation. Right? You embarrass someone, you humiliate someone, there is monetary compensation for that. Rabbi Yehuda says that avadim and Eved doesn't have boshes, doesn't have humiliation. So if you humiliate an Eved, ultimately, again, there is no payment. The Gemara says, my time is Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's logic? Amakra, ki natzu anoshim yachdov, ish ve'echov. Mish yesh lo achva, yotza Eved she'ein lo achva. So Rabbi Yehuda says, because the pasuk that talks about boshes, that talks about humiliation, talks about the lashon of kinatzu anoshim yachdav ish ve'echav. So someone who has echav, someone who has achva, familial relations, from people who is related to achva, a sense of family, he has boshes. Someone who does not have achva, ultimately, again, it doesn't have boshes. And therefore, an Eved, Rashi says, or Eved she'in lo achva, va'afilu im echav b'nei aviv dichsiv amachamar, im achamar, im adom l'chamar, eino eloki behema. So from a halachic perspective, an Eved does not have familial relations. So because of that, therefore, on a technicality, he is not entitled to boshes. Incredible. Rabbanan will say, echav hu b'mitzvus. The Rabbanan say, no, it's not true. What does echav mean? Echav doesn't refer to someone who has familial relations. Rather, what does echav refer to? Someone who is your brother in mitzvos. And interestingly enough, an Eved is your brother in mitzvos. Why? Because an Eved, remember we're talking about an Eved Kanani over here, right? Because an Eved Ivri is a full-fledged Jew. So an Eved Kanani. An Eved Kanani is still your brother in mitzvos. How so? Because an Eved Kanani, remember again, is still chayiv in any mitzvos that a woman is chayiv in. So therefore he's your echav mitzvos, and therefore the Rabbanan say he does have boshes. So the Gemara says, V'halchi hechi darish. And over here, in our context, in our subject, how are we dashing the psukim? Rabbi Huda Savra me'achav. Rabbi Huda says me'achav. So also remember again, lashon over here is ki matzei ish gonev nefesh me'achav. If a person will be found to be kidnapping another person, me'achav. So watch this. Rabbi Huda darshins me'achav la fuke avadim. Echav comes to exclude avadim. That avadim are not included in the halachos of kidnapping, and therefore, again, if somebody kidnaps an eved, ultimately, again, they're not liable. So the Gemara says, Bnei Yisrael, l'me'ute mishechatzi v'chatzi bnei chorin. And again, when it says Bnei Yisrael, that comes to exclude even a chatzi eved, chatzi bnei chorin. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Bnei Yisrael, l'me'ute mishechatzi v'chatzi bnei chorin. Bnei Yisrael, l'me'ute chatzi v'chatzi, sorry. I just lost the place. Me'achav la'fuke avadim b'nei Yisrael mi'utim mishechatziav eved v'chatziav b'nei chorin. Mi b'nei Yisrael mi'utim mishechatziav eved v'chatziav b'nei chorin. Have a miut achamir. So we'll say this is very interesting. In Rabbi Huda's drasha, watch this. So me'achav comes to exclude an eved. Good. So mi b'nei Yisrael comes to exclude chatzi eved v'chatziav b'nei chorin, and then again mi b'nei Yisrael. There's two exclusions of chatzi eved v'chatziav b'nei chorin. What is that? That's called a miut achar miut. So remember again, that's called an exclusion after an exclusion. Whenever you have a miut achar miut, a miut achar miut el rabos, and a miut after a miut only comes to go ahead and include. Good. So the Gemara says as follows. So that's why I will say, interestingly enough, that's why Yehuda holds that if you kidnap a chatzi eved chatzi b'nei chorin, you're chayiv. Ultimately, again, you are allowed. I think the fast starts in just a moment. Right, I think 6:08, okay? Good. Okay, so we'll say, so therefore again, miut achar miut. Ultimately, again, it is an exclusion after an exclusion, and the halacha is that miut achar miut comes to include. What does it come to include? Ultimately, again, it comes to include liability for kidnapping of a chatzi eved chatzi b'nei chorin. That's Rabbi Huda's drasha. The Rabbanan, what will they say? Rabbanan me'echav la'fuke avadim lo mashmalu. The Rabbanan don't really hold of that echav, because remember again, as we saw before, the Rabbanan use echav to teach me what? They use echav to teach me echav b'mitzvos. So therefore, they don't see echav as an exclusion for avadim. Because ultimately the eved is my brother in mitzvos, b'nei Yisrael, and again, when it says b'nei Yisrael, mi b'nei Yisrael, chal mi'ute eved. One is to exclude eved. The chal mi'ute chatzi eved chatzi b'nei chorin, and one is to exclude chatzi eved chatzi b'nei chorin. Okay, so we'll say. So ultimately, again, so just to understand what we're left with over here is our fundamental machlokes. If you kidnap a chatzi eved chatzi ben chorin, are you chayiv or not? Rabbi Huda says yes, you are. Where does Rabbi Huda get it from? Essentially, it's a miut achar miut. B'nei Yisrael, mi b'nei Yisrael, exclusion after exclusion, miut achar miut is l'rabos, come to include. What does it come to include? Ultimately, again, chatzi eved chatzi b'nei chorin. The Rabbanan ultimately, again, reject that drasha, and they exclude chatzi eved chatzi b'nei chorin, chatzi eved chatzi b'nei chorin. Both say the Rambam paskins, ultimately, again, like the Chachamim, and therefore, if one were to go ahead and kidnap a chatzi eved chatzi b'nei chorin, one would be pater. Okay, incredible. Now the Gemara asks an interesting question. As far as the gonev nefesh minayin, from where do you see, where's the lav? Where's the lav to go ahead and kidnap someone? Rabbi Yoshia Amar, Milo Signov. Rabbi Yoshia says, we're not from Lo Signov. Don't steal. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Milo Yimkeru Mimkeres Eved. Rabbi Yochanan says, we learn out from the pasuk of you shall not sell him like one would sell a slave. Okay, the Gemara says fine. So the Gemara, and the truth is not really arguing. Marka chashav lav digneva, or marka chashav lav de mechira. So we'll say this is very interesting. Remember again, what did we already establish in the Mishnah? Essentially, in order to be liable for biblical kidnapping, you need 3 steps. Number one, you need to kidnap someone. Number 2, you need to bring them into your rishus. And number 3, you need to sell them. The truth is, there's really four because you also have to make use of them in some way. So really 4 steps, but we'll call it 3. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Yochanan are not arguing. One is quoting the pasuk that says the law of kidnapping itself, and the other is quoting the law ultimately again that you can't sell the individual. So they're not really arguing. They're just highlighting different parts of the prohibition of kidnapping. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, good. Tan Rabbanon. Lo signov. Torah says, do not steal. Begonev nefashas hakasav medaber. The Torah is talking about, again, kidnapping. So we'll say, you tell me that lo signov is talking about kidnapping. How do you know that? Or ena ela begonev mammon. I don't know. How do you know that? Maybe it's talking about stealing money. How do you know that it's talking about stealing people? So the Gemara says, Oh, ena ela begonev mammon amrit say ulamad mishloshes femido shaytaron the jeshes ban. So we'll say, so let's analyze this pasuk using our exegetical principles. What's the exegetical principles? Davar halamed mi'inyano. So we'll say, so sometimes the way to understand what a particular pasuk is talking about is how? Through the analyzation of the context in which the pasuk is stated. That's what's called davar halamed mi'inyano. Something, a pasuk that can be understood from the context in which it was stated. So listen to this. B'ma kosav medaber. So we'll say the pasuk that says, lo signovu, lo sechachashu, v'lo seshakri ishpa amito. What are we talking about over here? So the Gemara says, no, sorry, that was the wrong pasuk. The pasuk we're talking about is lo sirtzach. Sorry, asarsa debros. Lo sirtzach, lo sinaf, lo sinog, lo signov, lo sanabrechayit shaker. So it's asarsa debros, right? The context is don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, and don't be a false witness. That's the context in which lo signov is mentioned. So now listen to this. So the Gemara says, "Makos medaber." What is the Torah talking about over here? The Gemara says, "Makos medaber benefashos." Now, also, when you look at the context, what's the context? Don't murder, don't commit adultery, and don't steal. So murder and adultery are both capital offenses. And lo signov, don't steal, is written in the midst of these capital offenses. So therefore, you already see that the Torah is talking about capital offenses. So therefore, it makes sense to say that the gneva that we're talking about is also a capital offense. When you steal money from someone, that's not a capital offense. So therefore, Allah we must be talking about over here, gonev nefashas, tanya idach, another brayso, lo signovu, begonev mammon. The pasuk says lo signovu. So we'll say, so this is the pasuk quoted before. Lo signovu v'lo sechachashu v'lo seshakru ishpamito. Don't steal, right? Don't lie. And one, right, lo sechashu literally means like don't contradict. But again, also means don't deny, and don't lie one to his fellow. So the Gemara says, begonev mammon akasim adaber. That's talking about stealing money. How do you know that? So the Gemara says, Atar begonev mammon ina begonev nefashas. How do you know it's about stealing money? Maybe he's talking about stealing people, kidnapping. Once again, we'll say this is a fascinating exegetical principle. So, which principle? Davar halabi me'inyano. Understand what a particular pasuk is talking about through the context in which it was stated. What is the Torah talking about over here? B'mammon. So let's remember again, the rest of the pasuk of lo signovu, lo sechachashu, lo seshakri shamito is all talking about financial liability. Therefore, the gneva in this context must also be financial liability. B'mammon, afkan b'mammon. So let's say so very important. So therefore, lo signov in the Aseret Hadibros is talking about kidnapping. When the Torah says don't steal, it's talking about kidnapping. How do we know that? Context. Since the other offenses mentioned over here, don't murder, don't commit adultery, are capital offenses, therefore Allah said the gneva mentioned over here is also a capital offense. When the Torah says lo signovu, do not steal, that's talking about stealing money. How do I know that? Context. because the other offense is over here. Lo sechachashu, do not deny a claim, do not lie about a claim, is monetary compensation, and therefore again, Gneva is talking about money. Incredible. Itmar was an interesting case over here. Supposed to say, now watch this. This is a fascinating case. So now remember, we've established again that Allah in order to be liable for kidnapping, you obviously have to kidnap an individual, you have to take them into your shus, you have to go ahead and utilize them as someone, you have to sell them. So now in this case over here, interestingly enough, right, we have witnesses who come forward. One set of witnesses comes along and says, we saw Ruvain kidnap Shimon. Second set of witnesses say, we saw Ruvain sell Shimon. Now we'll say, under normal circumstances, how would you generate liability for kidnapping? How would you do it? One set of witnesses, right? Eidos, but one set of witnesses who say, we saw Ruvain kidnap and sell Shimon. Interestingly enough, in this case, you have two sets of witnesses. So now, this is going to present an interesting halachic issue. So, Idmar, now what's the problem? The problem is both sets of witnesses were made into Eidim Zomamin. Right? So again, another set of witnesses says, hey, first said, you cannot have seen Ruvain sell Shimon steal Shimon, kidnap Shimon, because you were with us that day. And they say to the second set, you couldn't have said, it could be the same set of witnesses, same set of mazim or second, it doesn't matter. And they say to the second set of witnesses, you couldn't have seen Ruvain sell Shimon. Why? Because you were with us that day. So I'll say, so now, look at Rashi for just a moment. Shnei kitei edim, it's Rashi, edei gneva ve'edei mechira. Shnei kitei edim, achas he'ida shekana v'sanefesh v'achas he'ida shemachar. So two separate sets of witnesses. Each one set testified that Ruvain kidnapped Shimon. One set testified that Ruvain sold Shimon. So now we'll say, so now they're both made into Eidim Zomin. So remember again, what's the halacha? How does Eidim Zomin, right, when witnesses are made into Eidim Zomin, what's their punishment? Reciprocal punishment, kasher zamam. So therefore, again, how should these witnesses be punished? How should they be punished? Remember again, if their testimony was accepted, it would have resulted in the death of Ruvain. Ruvain would have put to death. So if we should put these witnesses to death, here's the problem. What's the problem? Neither set of witnesses delivered a complete testimony which would have resulted in the death of Ruvain. Right? Because one set testified that Ruvain kidnapped Shimon. Well, that's not enough to put Ruvain to death. The second set of witnesses testified that Ruvain sold Shimon. That by itself is not enough to put them to death. So both say, see what happened over here? So therefore the Gemara says, what do you do with these witnesses? So Rashi says over here, Ein nerag, the first time of Azal, kevadeinu lo mekatli ihu nami, ilo huzmu lo miktal, tahavile edus she'atolach azima, v'lo meshkachas ademakto elo bekat achos. So the Gemara seems to be suggesting, so now let's see, that's the context. So essentially, neither set of witnesses is delivering a complete testimony which would have resulted in the death of Ruvain. They're each delivering partial testimony. So what's the halacha? Chizkiah Amar. Now when they're made into Eidim Zomin, Chizkiah says, Ein haragin, you can't put no witnesses to death. Rabbi Yochanan Amar neharagin. Rabbi Yochanan says, yes you can. Yes, you can. What's the machlokes? Chizkiah Damar Rabbi Akiva Damar Davar V'lo Chatzi Davar. Shabbos say Chizkiah is like Rabbi Akiva. Now the truth is, this machlokes, Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanan, Rashi points out over here, is a machlokes in Baba Basra, cheskas habatim. That ultimately, again, can you put Eidim Zomim, can you put witnesses to death? Ultimately, again, if they're only delivering partial testimony, partial incriminating testimony. Rabbi Akiva says no. Rabbi Akiva says, Al pishne Eidim Yakum Davar. Davar means complete testimony. Therefore, witnesses can only be put to death as Eidim Zomimin if their testimony was complete. But if they only delivered partial testimony, you cannot execute them with Hazama based on that. Davar v'lo chazi davar. Rabbi Yochanan on the other hand is like Rabbanan. Davar v'afilu chazi davar. Okay, Rabbi Yochanan is like Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say no, even if witnesses do not deliver complete testimony, but they're a piece in the puzzle, ultimately, again, they can be put to death as well. Okay, so also his fundamental machlokes. Umod Chizkiah, even Chizkiah would agree Interesting. Be'edim achron shel ben sorer or mora. Well, so listen to this. We actually just saw this a couple of days ago. This was actually I think this was a new piece of information. Ben sorer umora, the first time that he steals money to buy meat and wine, he's not convicted, right? The first time is a warning. The first time is malchus. It's only the second time, ultimately, that he's put to death as ben sorer mora. So watch this. Let's say again, second, Chizkiah would agree, be'edim ha'achronim shel ben sorer umora shehuzmu sheneragin. So say, listen to this. So let's say again, you have a second set of witnesses. So we'll call the kid Ruvain, right? So second set of witnesses come along and say, we saw Ruvain steal money from his father to eat meat and drink, to purchase meat and wine, and he ate, like we saw before, he ate the meat and wine in someone else's rishos. Someone else's rishos. So what's the halacha? And those witnesses, now imagine the case. Second set of witnesses show up. We saw Ruvain steal money and purchase meat and drink wine. Then another set of witnesses come along and say, so witnesses, you cannot have seen that because you were with us. Edim zomimin. So now we're going to put them to death because they were going to put Ruvain the kid to death. So I'll say, they could claim 1 second, but we only came to give him malchus, right? Our testimony by itself is not enough to incriminate him. You need the testimony of the first set of witnesses. Even Chizkiah would agree that in this case, those witnesses are put to death. Why? Mitoch she'echolim lomar harishonim amudbeis la'kol salbanu v'hani achrini kuli davar ka'avdile. No, because the first set of witnesses could say, look, all our testimony did was to make Ruvain the kid liable to malchus. And therefore the entire death penalty really rested on the testimony of the second set. Okay, incredible. So Masker above. So I just want to just you appreciate what's being introduced over here. So what's being introduced over here is when you have two sets of witnesses, both who are delivering important information, but neither who are able to ultimately convict the offender of the death penalty with their sole testimony. So therefore, if they turn out to be Edim Zomimin, what do you do with them? Can you put them to death or not? So this is the fundamental machlokes between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. Chizkiah says no. Chizkiah says no, because Chizkiah is based on Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says davar v'lo chatzi davar. The only time you can put Edim Zomin to death is when their testimony was complete to put the defendant to death. But if they're only delivering partial testimony, you can't convict them. You can't give them reciprocal punishment of death. On the other hand, Rabbi Yochanan holds that no, as long as their testimony was part of the incriminating process, right? And had they been found to be correct witnesses, they would have had a hand in the execution of the defendant. You could visit reciprocal punishment upon them and ultimately execute them. That's our machlokes. Okay, so we'll say Pevav and base, second line down. Maskiv Rapapa Ihachi Eidi Mechira Nami Lik delay. So if that's the case, Rapapa says, then we should put the witnesses who testify about the Mechira, we should also put them to death. Why? Mitoch she'echolin eidei gneva lomar lahalkol sabanu. Remember again, the eidei gneva could always say, look, all we came to do was to make him chayif a malchus, right? Because we both say, if Reuven kidnaps Shimon and technically doesn't sell him, so all Reuven is liable to is malchus. He's not chayif for gneva under those circumstances. So Allah Alamayis, again, we should say that complete liability rests upon the Eidei Mechira. V'chitema de kasavar Chizkiah de lo laki. So is Chizkiah suggesting that one who goes ahead and kidnaps someone would not be liable malchus? V'ha itmar, but we learned, Eidei Gneva benefesh shehuzmu. So ultimately, again, if you have witnesses who testified that Reuven kidnapped Shimon, and then those same witnesses remain to Edim Zomamin, Chizkiah Rabbi Yochanan, Chad Amar Lokin, V'chad Amar In Lokin. One opinion says that they get malchus. One opinion says they don't get malchus. V'aminon, we said, to Stayin the Chizkiah Damar Lokin. It must be Chizkiah who says that ultimately they get malchus. Why? Mida Amar Chizkiah Ein Neheragin. Since Chizkiah says they're not put to death. If they're not put to death, then obviously the halacha is that they get malchus. Di'i Rabbi Yochanan, because again, if it was Rabbi Yochanan, Kevan Amar Neheragin, Havili Lav Shenitin Las Haras Misas Bezin. According to Rabbi Yochanan, once he's being executed, so this is a lav that is given over to execution by Bezdin. V'chol Lav Shenitin Las Haras Misas Bezin in Lokin Alav. And I will say in general, the halacha is, anytime Bezdin is executing someone, there's not malchus for that same infraction. So the Gemara says, Ihu lo laki inu echilaku. So in that case, if technically speaking, the kidnapper is not going to be given Malchus, so you're going to go ahead and give. You're going to give the Eidim Zomin Malchus. It doesn't make any sense. Ella Amra Papa, rather Papa says this also. Rabbi says it's a very important line. Ella Amra Papa, Be'edi Mechira, to Kuli Amalo Pligi Dinei Ragin. So Rabbi says this is very interesting. Everyone agrees that if witnesses come along and testify, right, we saw Ruvain sell Shimon, that there's liability, and now let's say again, those very same witnesses are made into Eidim Zomamin, that there is capital liability, those witnesses are executed. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, through that testimony, the defendant, Ruvain, would have been made liable to death. So everyone agrees that under those circumstances, what we call those Eidei Mechira, those witnesses who testified that Ruvain sold Shimon, would absolutely be put to death as Eidim Zomamin. Okay, so where's the machlokes? Keep pligi. It is very interesting. Be'edei Geneva. The machlokes Rabosai is about the witnesses who testify about the kidnapping itself. The first set of witnesses, right? Those witnesses who say, we saw Ruvain kidnap Shimon. Now let's say those same witnesses are made into Eidim Zomamin. What is their liability? Now watch this. Chizkiah says, Ein neharagin. They're not put to death. Why not? Geneva l'chuda kaima, or mechira l'chuda kaima. Chizkiah essentially says that we look at the kidnapping and the selling as really two distinct things. And therefore kidnapping, interestingly enough, kidnapping by itself does not generate capital liability. Therefore, when the first witnesses come along and they testify that we saw Ruvain kidnap Shimon, what are they making Ruvain liable to? What are they making him liable to? To Malchus. To Malchus. That's it. And therefore, if they're found to be Eidim Zomamin, okay, you can make them subject to Malchus, but nothing more. It's really the second set of witnesses who testify that Ruvain sold Shimon. Those are the ones who make Ruvain liable to capital liability. And therefore, again, if the first set of witnesses are found to be Eidim Zomamin, they're not put to death. That's Chizkiah. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. Neragin. It's not true. It's not true. The first set of witnesses who testify that Ruvain kidnapped Shimon are also put to death. Why? Gneva aschalta de mechirahi. Because we will say, kidnapping is the beginning of mechira. In other words, how can you divorce the two processes? That doesn't make any sense. Of course, there should be liability for kidnapping itself. So we'll say, so this is fascinating, right? So this is our fundamental machlokes. So interestingly enough, according to Rav Papa's approach over here now, and I will say, these are right because this is going to build us into halacha l'maisa. According to Rav Papa, it goes without saying that halacha l'maisa, the Eidei Mechira, if they are made into Eidim Zomamin, will be put to death. Why? Because it's their testimony that Ruvain sold Shimon, that ultimately, again, would create liability for Ruvain. So if they're found to be Eidim Zomamin, they're put to death. What about the Eidei Geneva? So again, Chizkiah says, no, they're not put to death. Why? Because Geneva by itself will just make Ruvain liable to lashes. Rabbi Yochanan says, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? Right? Eidei Geneva, this is the beginning of capital liability. So of course, if they're found to be Eidim Zomamin, then halacha l'maisa, they are put to death as well. Incredible. Even Rabbi Yochanan would agree. So that seems to be where we're going to settle in the kidnapping case. Now, what about Ben Sora Mora? Because remember again, Ben Sora Mora is the other parallel case. Because what happens in Ben Sora Mora? Remember again, first set of witnesses by Ben Sora Mora, right? What are they making Ben Sora Mora liable to? Well, it's not Ben Sora Mora yet. What are they making the kid liable to? Malchus. So therefore, again, the first set, if they are made into Eidim Zomamin, will get Malchus. It's the second set who really create general liability. Umod Rabbi Yochanan be'Eidim harishonim shal Ben Sora Mora shehozmu she'ein neharagim. But even Rabbi Yochanan would agree that the first set of witnesses by Ben Sora Umora, if they're made into Eidim Zomamin, they are not put to death. Why? Because they could very simply say, listen, we didn't come to make this kid liable to death. What did we come to make him liable to? Malchus. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the reciprocal punishment for them would also be Malchus. Incredible. Amar Abaye says, so we'll say it's interesting. So Amar Abaye, listen to this phrase, we'll have to stop with this. Hakom odim ben Sora umora, v'hakom odim ben Sora umora, umacholkes ben Sora umora. So I'll say this is incredible. This is one of these great Jews. Only Jews can make statements like this. Right? Abaye says, everyone agrees with Ben Sora umora. Right? Everyone agrees with Ben Sora Umora, and there's a machlokes by Ben Sora Umora. So Rabbi say we're actually going to end off on this statement. We'll pick up with this tomorrow, but I just want to point out what an incredible statement this is to go into Purim with. Why? So when you look at this statement, what do you say to yourself? This makes absolutely no sense. But Rabbi say there's one thing that is absolutely clear, which is in the coming lines, this is all going to make so much sense. And let's say, what is the entire Yisod of Purim? Life is filled with circumstances that make no sense. But what's the Yisod in life? Keep reading, keep moving forward, keep learning, keep growing, and some way, somehow you'll see how all of the beautiful and holy pieces fit together. Also, we'll stop over here for today. Tomorrow morning, Am Yisroel Hashem, bright and early, 5:40. Maybe we'll start a little earlier even. Maybe like Tehillim at 4:30, and we'll go into. All right, stay tuned. I'll post it on the WhatsApp chat. And Am Yisroel Hashem, but I think share tomorrow morning at 5:40. Just as an we'll be learning in here in the base of Hersch, but Am Yisroel Hashem davening will be in the main shul tomorrow morning. I will say, Shkoyach.